welcome to Larry Kramer back, I think, for the third or fourth time in recent years. Proved to be one of our most popular speakers because he has such a really fresh, smart mind, and he knows what he believes, and he's not reluctant about challenging other people about their beliefs, but he does it in a very courteous way and a respectful way. In my informal survey among other foundation presidents in the United States, I will say I think that the truth is that Larry is the most admired by the largest number of people running foundations as someone who really does give fresh points of view on everything they talk about, when they agree or when they disagree. I haven't ever reported that fact to you, but it's true, and it's a wonderful, in a field where lots of foundation presidents feel like they've got to agree with everybody who comes and won't say no to anything. You have the reputation of
agreeing with anybody. I don't even agree with myself.
Not agreeing with anybody disagreeably. in any event. So in any event, I think in my own work, I've been struck by the work. Larry's now been at the Hewlett Foundation for 10 years, and he has created a culture there. I think it was there at the beginning under Paul Brest, and it's one of those foundations. Not every foundation chooses perfect presidents. The trustees do. In the case of Hewlett, 3 out of 4 of their presidents were very good presidents of foundations. I would say absolutely first-class presidents. Somehow, the second one was not. And part of the reason, I think, is that he didn't want to live in San Francisco or in the Bay Area. He preferred to commute in from, I want to say, Utah. Is that right? Yeah. In any event, enough of the gossip. But the fact of the matter is that the tradition of good philanthropy, of well-done philanthropy, of important philanthropy, was established at Hewlett, and I think Larry has taken it to a new height, the things that they've done. We all have our favorite foundation programs. The one I mentioned to Larry earlier in our conversation beforehand is they started something called the Fund for Shared Insight. And the Fund for Shared Insight was to bring together foundation people to focus on how they could get data on the ultimate beneficiaries of foundation grant making. That is, are we okay?
I think Faye Tversky's up there.
What?
I think Faye is, right? Faye Tversky started that at Hewlett. She's now the president of the Blank Foundation.
Yeah.
She's here,
She's also speaking here next month.
Guess we know what you're supposed to talk about, Faye.
In any event, the idea, the creative idea that Faye brought to the table, and that encouraged by Larry, was let's figure out how we can get data on the ultimate beneficiaries of grants. Not the nonprofits that get the money, but what the people who benefit from the money, who actually, where the money is being spent ultimately. And not only they started, they brought in, I think, ultimately 10 or 15 other foundations to do work jointly with them. But that's just one example. More recently, and Larry's going to talk about it in the talk today, he I think took the lead in establishing a program on democracy, and we'll talk about how that evolved and why it is so important and how they're going about doing what they're doing. And of course, everybody knows that Hewlett Foundation, I think before Larry got there, started ClimateWorks, which is a large multi-billion-dollar initiative of the Hewlett Foundation and the Packard Foundation, which is still the largest, I think, figure in the ClimateWorks field. I think with a number of, when Larry became president, I think he changed the governance of what they were doing to include more options for other foundations and donors to join in with them. And it has been a very important actor in the field of climate. And so with that, I just want to welcome Larry again. It's always refreshing to have you here. It's always stimulating, and I look forward to what you're going to talk about today, and then I'll reserve the right to ask you questions or disagree with you. There you go. Got it.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for the generous welcome. Actually, the Fund for a Shared Insight point does underscore one thing, which is if you get foundation CEOs here, the truth is the vast majority of what our foundations do, we're not actually responsible for, right? The staff is responsible for both generating the ideas and implementing them, Fund for Shared Insight being a good example. And I think it's important to know that what I am going to talk about today is one of the exceptions to that, which is something that that when I went to Hewlett largely for. So I want to actually walk you through the story of our evolution in democracy funding, because I think it sets up nicely where we are today, how we're thinking about it, and then hopefully opens up a conversation about how to think about the problem generally. As I said, for me, my academic career, I wrote about a lot of different things. The work I was most centrally involved in was as a constitutional historian, and I was most interested in what were the conditions necessary to make popular government possible. That was really what I was writing about courts, but it was a place in which to discuss that issue. And there's a story you can tell across American history that works reasonably well. It's been largely qualified in a million ways by political scientists appropriately, but still it worked relatively well, in terms of the way in which there would be broad cycles within the political system. We went through, you go the Republican domination from, say, 1856 or 1860 through the New Deal, and then the Democratic domination from the 1932 election through probably would have been 72 with Nixon, but Watergate kind of messed it up, so it's 80 with Reagan, and we've been through another one of those waves, and it looked like it was coming to an end. 2006, the Democrats retake Congress. 2008, the Democrats retake the presidency, and by all rights, if that story were still working, 2010 should have been a Democratic consolidation year. And instead, they got destroyed in the midterm election. It was one of the 2 or 3, I think, maybe largest repudiations of a party at that time. And for me, that was like, what are we missing? There's something clearly different going on here than what I had expected. And when I thought about it, of course, evidence is often subject to multiple interpretations. The interpretation I've been using was the one that I expected to see, so I was finding it. But when you went back and looked at what was going on, you could see the seeds of something different emerging, really starting in the 60s, around the Civil Rights Act and the first wedge campaign run by Nixon, but that had been growing ever since, and now, expressing itself as what at the time people were referring to as political polarization, which was really the consequence of it, but that had locked down the government, made it impossible to get much done at the federal level, was seeping down and out to the state level and more broadly, and I thought, if you don't do something about this, I don't really see a future for American democracy. You could see the seeds of the ending of this system that we become so comfortable with. When I interviewed at Hewlett, when the opportunity for Hewlett opened up in 2012, one of the things I was interested in doing if I went there was it was an opportunity to work on this problem and not just write about it. And when I talked to the board and interviewed, it was really what I talked about with them. I'm pretty sure it's probably what got me the job, because they had no other reason to give it to me relative to a lot of other stronger candidates that they had with better experience in philanthropy and in the world in which I was coming into. And so we started that work immediately upon arrival. It was really, while doing all the other things. Now, the democracy field at the time, when I'm talking about in philanthropy, was quite small. The largest bit of it was focused on problems of democracy outside the U.S., not in the U.S. at all. The Pew Charitable Trust had been very involved in campaign finance, but after they got the law passed, they had moved out of that field. There was a bad article written about them in the New Yorker, and they just abandoned the field at that point. Right at the time, of course, it became a battle, which had subsequently been lost. MacArthur was exploring it, but they decided not to move forward. Carnegie and Ford each had small programs, again, mostly focused outside the U.S., but with some little bits in the U.S., and a lot of work on media that called itself democracy, but it was really just about promoting better news coverage, which is not irrelevant to the democracy field, but wasn't what I was thinking about, which is what are the conditions for our political system to continue working. And I will say, it's not surprising in a sense. Look, what do foundations do? You decide we're going to go into field X. What does that mean? We're going to do education. We're going to do environment. And then you look for some problems or things you can do in that field that you can do something about and make it slightly better, right? Oh, let's go into education. Well, let's do open educational resources. That's a good opportunity. We can help people that way or whatever. And to the extent that there were funders in democracy, that was how they were thinking about it. So they were just working on some particular pieces. And what I had talked to our board about and what I was thinking about was something quite different than that. It really was a diagnosis that, the U.S. democracy is at risk of failing. That you can't have the kind of disaffection and alienation that you were already seeing broadly, and the inability of government, partly as a result, to address any of the major problems, and then that itself reinforcing the disaffection and alienation. You can't have that and sustain a democratic government. Now, I will say most of my peers, they didn't say I was crazy, but that was sort of what they thought. It was puzzling. Like, why would why we don't see it. Now, so we launched what we then called the Madison Initiative. And there were two premises underlying it, which I don't think we were as clear about stating as we probably should have been, but at least when I thought about it. And the premises, it's not that there were two premises underlying it, actually. It's that the way I thought about it, and still think about it, there are a lot of conditions necessary to have a good democracy. But there are two preconditions to have one at all. And if you don't have these two preconditions, then you can have a bad democracy, but you will not have any democracy without these two preconditions. And the preconditions are essentially pretty straightforwardly. One, the people within the society, the nation, have to see themselves as part of the same political community, notwithstanding their differences. They just have to accept that they're part of kind of one family, one political community, even though they disagree. And second, you have to have a governance process that's capable of addressing issues well enough to reinforce that first assumption, to keep people bought into the system as a whole. And those were the things that you could see breaking down certainly by 2010, 2012. I mean, if you really think about it, it's pretty clear by the mid-1990s, although there was still enough residual. Clinton was able to work with the Republicans, partly because their agenda overlapped so much. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But that we needed to do something to address that problem, right, broadly. And then we could start to think about all the other ways in which we could make our democracy better. But if we didn't fix this, we weren't going to have one for long. And I wrote a memo at the time that said, if we don't really address this, what you can expect sometime in the next 30 years is the election of a demagogue. Now, of course, I turned out to be 26 years off on that. I'll come back to that as well. But the theory of change as we began the Madison Initiative then was, how do we address that problem? And the idea was, we can sort of kill two birds at one stone by working top down. That is to say, when politicians do take their signals from the polity and other sources about what to do, but people take their signals from political leadership about how to think about it and about how to behave. And that the signals that were coming from our both political and media leadership were all about division, they're the enemy, they're out to destroy the country and so on. And Congress, as a result, wasn't capable of addressing any problems at all. So the thought was, if we can actually fix Congress, because it is still the central, most important political institution in American politics, by fix it meaning, there's no such thing as perfect Congress, but get it back to the point of kind of minimal functionality, the way it has worked across most of American history. What were the measures for that? Really, one simple measure I had in mind, if you think about public approval of Congress, it typically, across most of the period where we could measure it, bounced between 30 and 50%. That's pretty good, actually. 30 to 50% approving of Congress's, how well it was doing its job. If it gets up to 80, 90%, then it's tyranny. You can't trust that. But we were down bouncing in the 5 to 15% range. So it was like, if we can get back up to the 30 to 50% range, sort of as a proxy, that probably means Congress is doing a reasonably good job addressing the problems that the American people perceive. Now, they won't be. There'll still be a ton of other problems. We'll still have a ton of things to disagree about, but we can have those fights once we've sort of secured this basic foundation for moving forward. So a top-down strategy to let's recreate the conditions for Congress to begin to act, right? And what does that mean? I mean, so we focused on an assumption, which is people in Congress actually want to do stuff. They do. Like, it's a crappy job, right? The pay is awful, the hours are awful, the travel is awful, you're criticized all the time. You spend hours and hours doing this horrible dial for dollars thing. I'm a big fan of fundraising, but not the way politicians have to do it. That's like the worst, right? And yet they do the job, and they do it because really all of them, there are a couple of bad actors on both sides, I imagine, but the vast bulk of them, they want to do something good for the public, and they can't. And the diagnosis about why they can't is what we try to address. So a set of those issues were internal institutional issues, things like restoring the resources that they would need in order to do their own work, not have to rely on lobbyists for everything, have long-term staff that didn't leave after 2 or 3 years, so that again, all the experience was outside of Congress that they had to rely on, give them just the resources to do their own research and work, which had been steadily eroded since the mid-1990s, rebuild their relationships. Right? It was stunning to know how few. We met members of Congress who not only didn't know a single member from the other side, but barely knew the members from their own side. Partly because they have a 3-day work week and are flying home, partly because the structure of business, and partly because the breakdown in how they worked. So they used to do joint fact-finding sessions on major bills. Now each party ran its own, and so they weren't even on the same page on facts and so on. So what can we do to rebuild relationships that way was a second thing. And then there were rule changes that also made it very much more difficult. In particular, say, the centralization of authority at the leadership level. Right? If we're on the banking committee, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, we may not agree, but I really want to do something about banking because I put a lot of time into it and I understand it and I have ideas. I'm actually probably pretty willing to compromise with you. But if you take away my authority to do that by shifting it up to the leadership level where they do not have that interest, partly because the country is closely divided and every single election, one or both houses, is up for grabs, and compromising is not a good way of campaigning. So there were all sorts of things that were driving Congress to make it very much more difficult. So that was one set of activities, and then there were external pressures that also made it hard for candidates, for elected officials to actually work with each other. And by the way, I'm not talking about bipartisanship. That's actually the wrong way to think about it. Right? What we're talking about is, we think of it more as pluralism, which is to say, through most of American history, party identity was one factor in your decisions about how you voted in Congress. It was an important one, right? It might be dominant a very large percentage of the time, but it was not the only one. There were all sorts of other things. It might be that you had deep expertise in an issue. It might be that it had significant local importance for your people. It might be, it might be whatever. There were like lots of things. So you would have shifting majorities around different laws where you would get some people from each side. That's what had gone away. And we were locked into kind of these single party identities where party discipline had become super strong. And that was partly these internal factors, but very much a couple of external factors, in particular campaign finance, which was no longer controlled by the parties and party professionals who used to actually have an interest in governing well, but now was dependent on these super wealthy outsiders who were what political scientists refer to as intense issue demanders, right? And they were giving money, and it was an expectation of what you were supposed to do. Primary elections, and caucuses. That is to say, there's this myth about gerrymandering and that if you have competitive elections, it would change the dynamic. But if you look at the actual voting behavior of members in Congress, there's almost no difference between people in the most competitive and least competitive districts. And that's because you got to get through a primary in either one, and you got 5% turnout in the primaries of the most politically active at the extremes. So you're kind of held off by that. And then third, of course, is media. The fragmentation and emergence of highly politicized media. So we needed to think about addressing all of those. We focused on campaign finance and primaries, and at the time we thought, the media problem, that's just beyond our purview. It's being driven by market forces. We didn't really see much we could do about it. And my thought was, all problems are overdetermined, right? There's always more causes than you actually need. Conversely, then you don't need to address every single cause to address a problem. So if we can get a bunch of these, we can probably begin to change the dynamic. Okay, so that was the original Madison Initiative, and we moved forward, and then the 2016 election happened. And as I said, it was like 26 years ahead of time, the election of a classical demagogue, right? I mean, there's just no two ways around it. Everything about the Trump campaign and the way he governed is like classical demagoguery, which then was deepening the divisions hugely. And so we stepped back and said, okay, that happened way faster than we thought it would. What did we miss? And we identified two additional sort of pieces of work. One was, you know what, we can't ignore the media issue. The disinformation problem is just too big, and we're going to need to work on that and address it. And so we launched an effort there. And then second was what Joel referred to as the thing I talked about last time I was here. In addition to a process that can work, there needs to be a sufficient overlap in ideas that it's possible to reach accommodations that work. So the way this really works is, you know, at any given time, there's an overarching set of ideas that structure debate and make normal politics possible. Left-right disagreements take place within them, because there's always room for disagreement, but there's a shared set of premises that you can move to find places to accommodate. And so in the 18th century, it was mercantilism. In the 19th century, it became laissez-faire. In the kind of mid-20th century, it became Keynesianism. And in the late 20th century, it became what we now call neoliberalism. And so if you think about Clinton, the reason he could do all that was because he was a progressive neoliberal, and he could work with conservative neoliberals on a set of solutions. They actually had fundamental agreements about relatively the relationship of government and markets to society and so on. And those paradigms, they're not right or wrong. That's the wrong way to think about them, but they're explanations that people use to make sense of the world around them. Now, for policymakers and academics, they're full political or economic philosophies that they use to generate solutions to problems. For ordinary citizens, it's much more a bumper sticker understanding. Market's good, government bad, you know. And the paradigm, and then the role of politicians is to take those solutions being generated and translate them for ordinary citizens. And the solutions then have to work well enough to reinforce the bumper sticker understanding. Because it's always a messy world and it never lines up completely. These paradigms are an ideas framework. They don't absolutely control. They can be overcome by other interests or forces, the serendipity of events, the quality of advocates, all sorts of things. So you get a messy real world, but they operate as a kind of thumb on the scale, and they enable a kind of conversation. When they break down, usually because the world changes in ways that they stop working, you get periods of significant political disruption. We saw that, right? The breakdown of laissez-faire, partly as a result of World War I, much more as a result of the Great Depression, really as a result of major transformations in communications and transportation, Second Industrial Revolution, urbanization. When it stopped working, you got serious political disruption and people drifted to the next best explanation. Some people became communists. Some people became fascists. Keynesianism was a kind of compromise and a modification of market-based thinking that worked reasonably well, gave a different role for government, and took. Right? And that worked until kind of the late 1960s, early 70s, when another set of changes in the way the world worked, in particular the reemergence of Germany and Japan into markets, because people didn't realize the extent to which the Keynesian system they set up after World War II rested on US hegemony. And as that started to soften around the edges, it created kinds of disruptions. And then the US goes off the gold standard, and Bretton Woods breaks down, and then you get the oil shocks because of the organization of and all of this, and suddenly the world feels like it's coming apart at the seams. Also socially, right, because the Keynesian idea of government management had spread to other domains, and people start to drift. We forget today how many extreme lefty kind of alternatives were out there in the 60s, but neoliberalism takes. And it takes for reasons that we can talk about if you're interested in any event. And now we're in another one of those periods of disruption. Right, that is not working for people. It's generated massive wealth inequality that it cannot address within its own frames. Climate is a huge problem it cannot address. Technology has changed the way markets work so that the neoliberal approaches to them are not working. We're getting massive concentrations of wealth that we don't know how to, all sorts of problems, and people are drifting to the next best explanation. The problem is the next best explanation right now is ethno-nationalism. Right? In the US, that's Trump. In England, it's Brexit. In India, it's Modi. In Brazil, it's Bolsonaro. But we're seeing globally that same kind of drift towards as a way of thinking about things doesn't work. So we need to offer people something better. So that's another piece of work that we've taken on since 2016. Then the 2020 election happens. All right. Now, I will say, we believed, and I still believe, we had made much more progress in the Madison Initiative prior to 2020 than would be apparent on the surface. In particular, inside Congress, significant changes had begun and are still continuing on a lot of the underlying pieces. They're not going to change the outcomes because the politics is still what it is. But if you look, say, at the House Select Committee on Rules for Congress, they've made major changes and created lots of opportunities. And although you don't see it on the major legislation, even in the Trump years, there was significantly more bipartisan legislation, let's say legislation supported across party lines, than had existed during the Obama years and before that. And there are lots of causes for that, but this is one. Similarly, we couldn't figure out how to go after primaries per se, so instead we focused on ranked choice voting as a solution that would work in primaries and general elections, and there was real momentum picking up for that. It's a long haul, but a couple of states have now adopted. A lot of localities, it's on the agenda in a way that it had never been. Still, that was going to be a long, slow effort, and there was progress, but not massive progress. And we had made very little or no progress on some important pieces like campaign finance and so on. And then, not before the 2020 election, you have the run-up to that election. You have COVID, which creates enormous new tensions around all sorts of issues. You have the racial reckoning in the wake of George Floyd's murder, which creates all sorts of new issues and tensions. And then the election process itself. We see just an enormous change in the problem set as we were thinking about it. So coming out of the 2020 election, we thought, okay, what do all these things mean for this work? One, they probably mean that we can't continue that same long, slow effort. That is to say, the instability that we spotted in 2012, that got worse after 2016, got way worse after 2020. And in two particular ways, one particular way, that if we don't pull back and address it, we're not even going to get to the fundamental problems of rebuilding the sense of a national community. And that is the problem of building trust in elections. Right? You don't have a democracy if people don't trust the election outcomes. And by the way, by trust the election outcomes, what we mean is it's the losers who have to trust the election outcome, not the winners. Winners are always going to be fine with the outcome. The question is, can you run an election where the people who lose accept the outcome of that election and then move forward into the next election? We also saw one other thing that we thought we would take on, which is an opportunity. So one of the aspects of neoliberalism, had been the long undermining both the idea that government is capable of performing competently, and then actually doing their level best to make that true by not supporting the government, right? And so lots was broken coming into 2016 already, but the 4 Trump years really took that up a couple of levels. And so coming out of it with COVID and the rebuilding that we knew was going to have to take place, we thought there was a real opportunity here to rebuild the capacity of the executive to deliver. And I'm not talking Build Back Better. I'm talking about the capacity to deliver. That is to say, the things that we can do. How do we attract? When I graduated from law school in 1984, it was, you wanted to go into government. I did a short stint, the best and the brightest. It was, you didn't necessarily want to have your whole career there, but you certainly wanted to spend some time, and many people spent their whole career there. It's really hard to attract the best and the brightest to government now. And that's partly a matter of money, but the money difference was there back when I graduated. It's very much just that sense that it's not a good place to go, combined with the fact that the government process for hiring people could not be more discouraging.
Yeah.
You apply for a job, if you're lucky, it's 18 months until you find out whether you got it. In the meantime, you're going to go find another job. And that happens over and over and over again. So civil service reform and just reestablishing the sense that actually government is a place where you can go and get stuff done that will matter to people. Technology. Right? The government's technology is at least a generation, maybe more behind where it needs to be in order to perform well and so on. So there's a whole slew of things that we thought this is an opportunity perhaps to rebuild executive capacity so that as the government then starts to do things, and here's where Build Back Better matters, and the infrastructure bill, and the rescue plans, the federal government and the state governments are spending more money than they have in several generations. It's both an opportunity and a risk. If they spend it badly, it's going to reconfirm that notion of government incompetence. If they spend it well, it will help us very much in the rethinking political economy work and just for the public generally. I will say the certainty that everybody, left to right. I had dinner with a very left person who nevertheless just like took it as casually obvious the government is totally incompetent. And I said, it's funny, I was in Uganda a couple of years ago. You want to see what a country looks like when the government isn't functional? Go to Uganda, right? Like our governments do so much so well that you're not even thinking about it. You're taking it so for granted. You have roads, you have electricity, you have water. Okay, that may be a bit of a problem in some places. You have police. I mean, there's also a bit of a problem in some ways, but nevertheless, not compared to what you're talking about in these. So yes, it can be better, and yes, it needs to be better. But the truth is, the attack on government has mostly been by anecdote, and Solyndra being a good example. That $90 billion that the administration spent on clean energy back in 2009 was one of the most effective investments the United States has ever made. It had unbelievably positive effects. And one story was able to discredit the whole thing, and actually even that story was distorted because even Solyndra turned out to actually be technology that had really powerful uses. So those were the two things that we wanted to focus on. Plus, of course, doubling down on the disinformation problem, which has become even more clear of its importance. Now, the change there, though, that we've learned, I think, is this, which is when we started that work in 2016, we were thinking of disinformation as a problem. We now realize it's not one problem. It's actually many different problems. And it's different problems because although it's not all done through the internet. It's done through all the channels that people get information about and from. Two, it's done by different groups in different ways, using different channels differently depending on what it's about. So election disinformation is actually a different problem from health disinformation or whatever, pick your disinformation problem. So we decided, well, let's focus, at least if we're trying to rebuild trust in elections, let's do what we can about election disinformation. The congressional work we put on simmer. So we have tried to leave in place so that it won't end the ecosystem that we had built to help continue work with which it's still going on, work with Congress at least to rebuild their interior resources. But we did sort of move out of other areas like campaign finance because we don't see any short-term opportunities there, and we think it's more important to work on what we're working on. Now, the last point I just want to finish with is really in some ways the most important, which is the difference in the way Hewlett is approaching this problem from other foundations. Because while the field was small in 2012, it's not so small today. The 2020 election, the 2016 period forward, I think woke a lot of people up to the problem that maybe our democracy is at risk. And so now there's a whole lot of funders coming in, spending a lot of money around what do we do to save US democracy. Unfortunately, most of them are approaching it in ways that I think are counterproductive and actually making the problem worse. And that's because they're approaching it the way, there's two different things that I think are operating in the way most foundations are thinking about this. One is they're thinking about it the way they think about their work in any areas. Yeah, US democracy is at risk. What's a problem with it that we can fix? Oh, gerrymandering, that's a problem, let's work on gerrymandering. Oh, vote suppression, that's a problem, let's work on vote suppression. And those are problems. But if you go at them that way, and in particular the way most of the foundations do, what you're nevertheless doing incidentally is you are widening that fundamental divide, which is still the bigger problem, right? You're deepening that sense of we are not part of the same community. So I had a conversation with a very big funder, I won't mention names, wants to come into this field in a big way. And they're doing, what you do responsibly, which is they're calling around to talk to other funders in the field. What do you work on? How do I think about this? And I said to this person, well, what are you thinking about working on? And they gave me the standard set of liberal things that they want to work on, vote suppression, gerrymandering, all those things I just mentioned. And I said to him, okay, tell me, imagine tomorrow, magically, you got everything you wanted in these efforts. Everything. It would just happen magically tomorrow. What do you think happens the day after tomorrow? Or the month after tomorrow, or in the next election after tomorrow? Like what you're assuming is you're going to win, which might be true, but what do you think the losers are going to do? Because what you have done and the way you have done it has just doubly confirmed their sense that the system is corrupt, that they're being excluded, that it's filled with fraud, whatever it is. So it's not to say you shouldn't work on those problems. It's to say you have to work on them, though, with a sense of this other issue and in ways then that close the gap, don't widen it. Now, The other reason, as I say, I think for a lot of foundations, what they don't accept is a premise that I've laid out, which is it matters what the losers think. That is to say, they think, and this is true on foundations on the left and the right that work on this, that the other side is just one punch away from being knocked out. That all we have to do is, if I can win this, if I can get these these laws that will prevent vote fraud on my side, or if I can get these votes that will get rid of the vote suppression on the other side, we're going to win elections, and that's what we need to do. Then we can enact our laws, and the world will move forward in the way that it should. And that used to be true. In a world where people do accept that they're part of one political community, they will move on when they lose. Right? Because they accept that as something that's part of the system, and they expect to be able to win at some other point down the line. But if that's not there, that's not what's going to happen. It's not what happens anywhere else, and it's not what's going to happen here. Right? Will we become Nazi Germany in 1933? No. Could we become Russia in the post-Putin period, or Hungary today, or yes, I think you can look around the world and see the different ways in which, as democracies fail in the 21st century, what that appears as. There is just no reason to think that we're immune from any of that stuff. If you get, or you could get significant, widespread civil unrest and violence, something like that. So so the idea is Now, why? Okay, so a funder on the left says, I'm not going to do anything about it. There is no voter fraud. We know there's no voter fraud, and they're right, there is no voter fraud. But there's voter suppression, so I'm going to work on voter suppression. Now, we also know that the voter suppression efforts have no effect on the outcomes. There's just a ton of evidence to this effect, right? But it doesn't matter, right? And it doesn't matter that there's no voter fraud either, because the question isn't what's right and true. The question is, what do people believe, and how are you going to address it? I'll give you my favorite example just to illustrate. Take the Dropbox issue. So Democrats want more Dropboxes because it makes it easier for people who they want to vote to be able to vote, and they're right, it does. Now, you don't have Dropboxes. It actually turns out that the people who are going to vote still vote. They're not good law. I mean, you should have them, because why would you make voting harder? But it's not like you need them to win elections, and it's not like having them is actually going to change the outcomes of elections. Okay, doesn't matter. Like, you should have them. People think that they're really important. Right? Now, people on the other side are like, no, those drop boxes, they're just an invitation for fraud. They're just an easy way for people to stuff ballot boxes and do all sorts of terrible things. And we know that's not true either. But why not have a conversation where we say, we hear you. So what do we need to do to make those drop boxes secure? The worst it's going to take is some spending of money, but let's figure out a way to have drop boxes, but make them secure. Can we do cameras? Can we put people, whatever? But no one is having those kinds of conversations at all. And so, as I say, that I think needs to be the approach if you want to rebuild confidence in the elections, as opposed to just sort of getting changes that you think are good changes without paying attention to how they're going to be perceived and taken in by the larger polity. And let me stop there.
Absolutely. Okay, the floor is open for questions, challenges, ideas. Damon.
Fascinating. Do I need a microphone?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll silence you.
We only have one.
But then we need to pass it back to Larry.
I'll just
So,
walk up here and make it easier.
thank you.
One, I think you're right on with your assessment of the problem, and you've got it head on. How? So let's say you're an election official in a state, say North Carolina, and you want to have this conversation around drop boxes or voter suppression or whatever. Do you have any solutions, or have you come across any situations where your foundation or others have been able to facilitate those conversations? Because right now, I work on a bipartisan board. We don't talk to each other that way. We don't, and we probably should. And so my question to you is with you 100% on the diagnosis, the question I think we're all looking for, and maybe looking to philanthropy for leadership is, okay, how do you facilitate those conversations?
Thank you. Great question. And so I don't have an easy answer for this because we just started. So we haven't done it yet. We're literally just starting. But it's something we've done in other areas. So it's something we've done in our Western conservation work. It's something we've done in our climate work. And so I think the short answer there is twofold, which is you begin to build trust. You begin to build trust not inside the government with the decision makers, because they're under so many different kinds of pressures. So you start outside with people who the decision makers on either side will listen to, right? So for instance, in our Western conservation work, we started by reaching out both to NGOs and to actual people in communities who we were pro environmental protection, but so the anglers hated us, the hunters hated us, the ranchers hated us, right? And of course the environmentalists hated them. And so we started there, outside the decision makers, with either the people they worked with or them themselves, bringing them together. It was a pretty long process of building some trust, getting people to share ideas, and then taking them up into the people who would listen to them. And we've had enormous success in some of these other areas. It does take time, but it is absolutely doable. But I do think that's the only way to do it. So you can't demand that government officials who are under a million kinds of pressures that they have to yield to are going to do this on their own by themselves. You have to create the conditions in which they can. And as I say, those exist outside, but it's certainly doable. We're doing it now. We're a little ahead of this on the economics stuff. So who would have thought that you'd find a whole bunch of people on the right who are willing to think about alternatives to neoliberalism? Now, their views are a little different than the people on the left, but we found lots of places where there's shared thinking and understanding, and working from there. Start with conversations. People are starting to write things together, go to meetings together, talk to each other, and then we'll begin to move it out from there.
Bill?
Why don't we just, I don't know. I can answer, but I'll build the answering to the question, otherwise we're going to
Can you
spend.
repeat?
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you grab the?
So just ask your question and I'll,
Okay.
yeah.
So thank you so much, Larry. This is really thought-provoking. So I started PolitiFact and I started the Association of Fact Checkers, and that was great in sort of the first wave of the internet.
We've made grants to you.
So, and we're grateful. The challenge now, though, is the facts are not getting to the right people. The facts aren't getting to the people who need them. And here we're reaching a time when the facts are so critical for democracy. What should we do as journalists, as fact checkers, to get those facts over the hump to the people who need them the most, and to kind of rethink how we present the content, because clearly it's not getting to the right people. And do we need to completely reimagine how we're producing journalism, how we're producing fact-checking, and I'm open to that. I used to think like people will come to PolitiFact and see the truth-o-meter and they'll be persuaded. Well, that clearly isn't. So I'm open to ideas.
Yeah. So for people out there, the question is, Bill is the creator, right? He's founder of PolitiFact, and the question is, how do we get the facts to people in ways that they will actually pay attention to them? Because right now we're either not getting to them or they seem to not pay attention to them. And why do they not pay attention to them? Because they're being told that they don't have to, or they shouldn't, or they're not right, or whatever. So I'll say a couple things on this, although we're still figuring this out, of course, and there's no easy solution. But so these are more my beliefs and my ideas. I don't know that Hewlett will follow through on all this because, as I said at the beginning, I will actually give the program director and officer discretion to develop a strategy and move forward. But so one, I don't actually think you should change what you do a lot. I actually think good journalism is good journalism. We need it. We don't need it to become less good journalism. The problem isn't lack of good journalism, right? So the problem that we have to figure out is how do we keep the bad stuff, get some of the bad stuff out of the way, or discredit it, or move it out of the way. And there, I actually still do think, okay, so so number one, so we have to change our law, and then we have to do some regulatory reform if we want this to happen. We have to change our First Amendment law, in truth. Now, there's nothing unusual about that. It is actually kind of standard practice in the law that when you have legal rights rest on, there's no such thing as an absolute right, okay? Right? There's a cost-benefit analysis for all of them. You can't falsely scream fire in a crowded theater because the benefits of that speech are tiny and the costs of it are really large, and so we say it's okay to regulate that. Every right is like that. But in addition to the explicit cost-benefit analysis, there's an implicit one, which is based on the world as people take it. It's invisible to us. We don't really see it, but it actually powerfully influences the explicit one. So I'll just take a different kind of example that to be familiar with the lawyers. In the 19th century, you have a tort law for wrongs, that has all these doctrines, privity and negligence and reasonableness and causation, and we use it. That's the explicit cost-benefit analysis. It's used to figure out when somebody who injures somebody else should be liable. Now, what they don't realize is it actually rests on implicit assumption which has to do with, there's not that many people getting hurt necessarily. So accidents on the highway, people are traveling on horses and by horse and buggy, and it's not that crowded. There's not that many accidents on the highway. Most products are being created bespoke. There's not huge distribution chains and hundreds of thousands of people using the same product and so on. Well, all that changes in the late 19th, early 20th century, and suddenly those tort laws, they do not work. The implicit cost-benefit analysis has changed in ways that require rethinking the explicit one, and we do it. Tort laws changed over the course of the 20th century to adapt to the modern set of circumstances. And that's an example, but it's true across the law. So it's true for our First Amendment law. You could say, the solution to bad speech is more speech, which nobody ever really believed. But it was okay to say that when the vast majority of people weren't being exposed to that much bad speech. Right? Because in the 19th century, we had tons of bad speech, but we were also still in a world in which there was a lot of social deference to elites. And the elites weren't crazy, whether they disagreed or not. Just as we really democratized in the early 20th century, for whatever complicated set of reasons, a responsible centrist media emerges. Right? So now that media has broken down. We're back to that period where tons of bad speech is there, but we're also heavily democratized and people aren't deferring to leadership anymore, and we have a different kind of problem. So we have to rethink our free speech norms in order to enable us to get at a lot of this bad speech. I'll give you an easy example from my perspective. Everybody agrees that false speech has low value. We nevertheless only regulate false speech in very narrow circumstances. One, we require the speaker to either knowingly or with reckless disregard to the falsity have put it out there. I think that's a sensible condition. But two, then we confine it even more narrowly by only a few limited categories in which there's discernible individual harm, like libel or child pornography. But we don't say, false speech, even if done knowingly and with reckless disregard, we're not going to punish that. Well, you could do that in a world where you didn't have to worry that much about it, where the risk of sliding down the slope of government regulation was very large, and the risk of not going down the other slope was very small. We're not in that world anymore, right? So it seems to me I would keep the actual malice requirement. That is, I wouldn't punish somebody who just makes false speech on public affairs. Much like, in the libel doctrine, it's got to be about a public figure. So you take that and just broaden that, not just about a public figure, but about public issues. But if someone intentionally or with reckless disregard for the falsity puts that out there, I think we should think about punishing them. That's shocking to people until you think about the consequences of our not doing it, which are really, really large. Then, so there's things like that. You can do all sorts of things. Then we still need to find a solution for the platforms, which are a different kind of problem. Right? Because they're not the speakers. I think of the platforms as the world's largest newsstands, essentially, except for this. They're not operating like a newsstand. A newsstand, I had to go to the newsstand to buy the journal. What the social media companies do is he might be interested in this, I'm going to push it out at him. Right? That's the way they work. As a result, they're passing through an immense amount of this horrible speech with no liability. Okay, what can we do about that? I'll give you just two thoughts. They said, you can't make us liable for that. Facebook has 2.5 billion users every day posting stuff. There's 40 million tweets a day. There's 400 hours of YouTube video being put up every second. We can't possibly, and that's true. So if you said you're potentially liable for anything on there that meets this kind of a test, you're going to put them out of business, and that would not be to anybody's benefit. But there are other options. We could, for instance, one, say, we're not going to make you liable under the Communications Decency Act for any single individual. Oh, no, we will make you liable for every single individual one, but the scope of your liability is going to be 1/10,000th of a penny per like or retweet or whatever it is, which means you actually don't need to worry about anything unless it's going viral. And they actually can police the viral stuff. They do it. They're doing it now. So, but if it's going viral after that amount, then you're liable, and we can then calibrate the liability for where we actually want them to be, by making it more or less per individual, whatever pushing out is. So that's one possible solution. Another one would be to say, you know what? you can be the largest newsstand in the world, but you can't push it out at people. You can't send it to them, and users can't send live links. Like if somebody reads a story, they can send a text to somebody else on the network saying, I just read this great story in Chicks on the Right, you should go look at this. But the person's gonna have to go look at it. They're gonna have to go find it. That is to say, the old system worked. There was always the crap, right? The Communist Party had a paper, the John Birch Society had a paper, there was the National Enquirer, all those terrible things at the newsstand. Now, we used to know what they were because there were signals for us, like they were near the adult magazines at the newsstand, or they were in the line at the grocery store. Now you can't tell the difference. They all look the same and they come at you the same. But also, in any event, I had to go get it. There was a little friction in the system, and it was just enough because most people don't want that stuff. But if you put it in front of them, they will read it and be affected by it. I wrote something, I said, I don't drive around looking for car accidents on the highway to rubberneck, but if I'm driving past one, as much as I don't want to, I do it. We all do it, or almost everybody does. Like, you can't help but not look. So what the social media companies have done is they've figured out ways to put those accidents along our route. So we're all seeing them. So it would be, let's just take away that capacity. You have to subscribe to get something. You have to go find it yourself. That's all. There's no infringement of anybody's free speech rights there. We're totally preserving their autonomy of both speakers and listeners to get and do whatever they want. All we're doing is taking away the company's power to create unwitting offices for commercial gain. So there's lots, and we need to think about some of those and begin to choke off the bad speech. But I don't think there's anything you or we could do, and just producing more good speech isn't going to do it.
We have,
Oh, sorry.
we have several on the chat.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, perhaps we could shoot now, then we could go back.
can we read them out to you?
Yeah, just read them out.
You want to read them out and you
Yeah,
can
sure.
reiterate?
So the first question is from Patricia Rosenfield. She's a senior fellow at the Rockefeller Archive Center. She submitted this question: what about the importance of local grassroots efforts? The focus of much overseas work is on democratic governance. What about civic education, especially in the era of distrust for one another, not just in elections and leaders, but also fear of the future?
So the question was, well, let's see, local grassroots efforts, what else?
Yeah, local grassroots efforts.
Civic education.
Yeah, civic education addressing that overseas work is not democratic governance, civic education, and just error distrust
Yeah, okay.
in government.
So we're focusing in this program, I'm tempted to look at the screen, on the U.S., but of course there's plenty of grassroots activity in the U.S., and civics education is definitely a huge problem. So those are all problems. Well, grassroots advocacy isn't a problem. I'll come back to that. Civics education is absolutely a problem. We actually do work on that. It's not part of this program. It's part of our education program. It's also a long solution, right? That's, we have, when I grew up, we had a very robust civics education requirements. I mean, I had requirements all through K-12. We got rid of most of them about 40 years ago, so now most students are required in most places to take one class, and they don't know anything. Now, civics education is not about, like, what are the three branches of government and is the Supreme Court final arbiter. It should include that, but civics education is really about what does it mean to be a citizen in a democratic society? What are your responsibilities? It's where you teach people this notion built into our Constitution that we're going to be a country filled with people who have different views and disagreements and passions and ideas, and we have to accommodate those with each other and live together. And your responsibility as a citizen is to learn about issues, to try and understand empathetically as best you can the people who disagree with you, and to find ways to work together. We need to teach that. But that's just a long-term process. I'm actually about to become the chair of the board at iCivics, which I joined and became partly because I do think it's so important. But we're not going to make it to the next generation being adults at the rate we are now. So this work is focused much more on what I regard as an immediate problem. Now, in terms of grassroots advocacy, I'm neither for nor against it. It has an inevitable role in a democracy. It can be super effective. There's a sense, one of the sort of things is that philanthropy has paid too little attention to it. Now we need to pay more attention to it. That's true in some areas, not necessarily true in others. I think it's orthogonal to what I'm saying, because there's no reason for grassroots advocates any more than anybody else to advocate in ways that are going to bring about the demise of the system. So it's a question not of who's doing it, it's a question of whoever is doing it, how are they doing it? And are we doing it in ways that are basically furthering the notion that we are rival tribes who are enemies, and the other side is out to kill us unless we kill them first, which is, what we're talking about moving towards and what we've seen where that takes us. Or do we do it in ways that recognize, the both and aspect, right? I mean, this is, on the race issues, I'll just step into what is in philanthropy, both a major issue and a huge controversy. It's like, how do we move, if you think about the problems that we need to deal with on race, we're not going to do it if we just think we're going to write off the whole half of the country that supports the Republicans. Like, there's just no way to win. There's no winning coalition there. There's not enough people, even if you mobilize. So, and it's not that you don't need to. It's like, there's a huge number of those people. I love Heather McGhee's stuff, some of us, or Reverend Barber. There are people who are saying it's a both and. It's like everybody is losing in this system, and racial minorities are losing in ways that are distinct and different and worse and need to be addressed as part of addressing the problems we share in common. And that's just a very different thing from the zero-sum game that, in fact, conservatives have created in order to maintain these divisions. Right? So it's not a question of who advocates. It's a question of whoever they are, do they advocate in ways that work within and create sustainability for this system?
Yeah, if I could ask one more, then we can get back to one a little bit. So on a similar note, I'll say it's sort of related to education. So it might be some overlap with that answer, but Joanne Florino asks, what role can our higher ed institutions play in restoring people's sense of being members of the same political community? Should there be a renewed focus on some sort of core curriculum in history, government, philosophy?
Yeah, so again, that was a variation on the civics education question. What should a civics education look like? And as I say, I think, we have to find ways to teach U.S. history. Right, we're struggling with this at iCivics because it's like you feel caught between one camp that's like we have to ignore race and another camp that is we have to teach that this country has simply been unjust. And the answer is this country has definitely been unjust, but has been working to fix that at the same time and has made some progress, and there's still a long way to go. How do you tell a complicated story? Now it's doable. It's absolutely doable, and we do have to figure out how to do that. It's not just a question, as I say, it's not fundamentally a question of just our education system, though it's broader. In my fantasy world, like every day after the day's work in Congress, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy would come out together and they would have a press conference. And their press conference would go, here's what we talked about today. And like, we don't really agree with them on this, but we understand where they're coming from, and here's what we sort of figured out we could do together. Like, if you did that every day, I think that would have a huge effect, as we see when they do it, which they do occasionally. I think the last major piece of legislation that fit that was the Every Student Succeeds Act back in the late Obama. It was accepted. It's not far from a perfect bill, but it made a lot of useful changes, and it was widely accepted precisely because it had that kind of bipartisan support. Francis Lee has done this work showing that there is no piece of legislation over the last 100 years that without kind of significant support across the political spectrum has actually been taken and been viewed as really successful and sunken, So now that's not going to happen in that form, but in some sense it's like, how do we do that? And the other thing that I believe that is a little different from a lot of people in philanthropy, although I respect this work, is it is a top-down point. It's like the signals that people are getting from political leadership and media leadership are shaping them, and we're not going to solve this problem like bottom up. So all these programs, like, let's take like a few people from the left and a few people on the right, and we'll get them to talk to each other, and they'll come out of the room saying, oh, they're not, I understand them, they're not so bad, they seemed like people to me, right? And that's good. As I say, I think those aren't bad things to do, but then what happens? One, you can't do that with 450 million people. And two is then you go home and you turn on Fox News or MSNBC and you talk to the same friends, and within a few weeks, having been re-exposed to all those same signals, you're back where you were. That is to say, we need something that's sustainable. And so I think the only way to do it is by changing the messaging from the top down, and that's, it's still hard, but I think that to me is the way we support a lot. We're part of the New Pluralists. It was Faye and Daniel did democracy program pulled us into that, but I'm supporting that. We have given a lot of support to One Small Step, which is the StoryCorps group, because I love what they're doing. It's not that I think we're going to solve the problems that way, but you know, who knows? I could be wrong.
So just wondering, have any learnings from the Madison Initiative influenced how other Hewlett programs, like when the effectiveness, have worked with government or tried to influence it?
So the question is, has our democracy work had any influence on how the other programs work? You know, I think the answer is yes, but not in some direct way like, oh, we did this, you guys should try that. It's much more the sensibility. And then, so, you know, we work in issue areas that are highly politicized: climate, abortion, you know, like, and I think conservation, actually almost all of our areas. And so I think the sensibility that it is actually possible to find people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, begin to engage them, build trusted relationships, find places where even if you can't work together, you can lower the temperature on the disagreements a lot. And so I think it's definitely had an influence that way. And then there are actually quite a few shared grantees. That is to say, where people, the Madison and Niskanen being the most obvious example, or our Street Institute. Madison began working with both of those, and now it's like, oh, you know what they're doing would help a lot in the climate program or in the cyber program, and so that's the other place that I can think that we've seen it.
We tried something like that in North Carolina, the North Carolina Leadership Program, which is part of the Sanford School effort, which works with people together at the same time on the right and the left. Mary Wilson, have you been involved in that at all?
I have not. no.
Yeah, well, I
Leslie Winter has, and she's on the Zoom somewhere.
My sense is that progress is made. Is there anybody here who knows about that? What is that?
Leslie is on the call. She's trying to speak up.
Oh, Leslie's on the. Leslie Winter was the president of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, and she was the co-head of the North Carolina Leadership Forum, the purpose of which is to do exactly what you're talking about doing, around specific problem areas, people from both sides. Did we locate Leslie?
We just can't hear her properly, but we're still running the program. Every year it changes topic and it brings together practitioners and policymakers.
So again, I think that especially if you're doing it with leaders, because that's where that's the only thing I feel really strongly about is it's got to be, leadership matters. You know, I mean, it just does, and so that's where the changes need to take place in terms of how the people are leading and at every level talk.
Heads of NGOs, so they're part of North Carolina politics, or yes.
But you have to sustain it too. As I say, we did lots of these, like put Democrats and Republican congressmen together, and they'd spend a few days, and they'd like each other, and then they'd go back, and they were still in the same situation. So it's not it's a kind of useful, but it's not going to ultimately
It
produce.
runs over a whole year actually, and so these relationships really have an opportunity to form.
Yeah.
And some of them have been sustained. There's actually I think in the North Carolina legislature, an education group that's grown out of the North Carolina Leadership Forum because those people got to know each other and now they still talk to each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
You had your hand up a couple times. You want to say? Yeah, no?
I feel like my question's sort of passed.
Okay.
I have a very simple question. Larry, I loved what you had to say today. My question is, part of the problem with functionality of Congress, it seems, is people say they're so long and there's such a concentration of just staying there is more important than being there in a way. Do you think term limits the amount of time they get an opportunity to make a difference? There's a research that shows that one step alone may have an impact.
Actually, the research shows it definitely has an impact, but the other way. Let's say term limits have been something that significantly increased polarization. And the reason, if you think about it, makes sense. I'm a big fan of term limits for executives, but not for legislators. So half of it is the legislative process is sufficiently complex and requires a kind of consensus building and working together that actually is facilitated by both experience and long-term relationships. Whereas people come in, they're new, they're only going to be there a short time, they're very firebrandy, they push for their stuff. They never really either develop the relationships or the knowledge of how to really work the process in quite the same way. And actually, if you look at who are the people who are willing to actually move, it's the older members. Right, and so it actually, longevity, again, of course there's too much of a good thing, as there are for many things, but as a general matter, the longer serving members are actually the better ones from the perspective of getting things done than the term limited ones. Ron Johnson's probably going to be an exception to that, but.
Two quick related questions. The first is, so my understanding, and Bill correct me if I'm wrong here, but is that both parties have disinformation, well, not have disinformation campaigns, but disinformation at times favors each party, but that one party stands to benefit much more from disinformation than the other. So my question for you is that I'm following your logic 99% of the way there, but losing you a little bit on why, what Hewlett is, if Hewlett succeeds in reducing disinformation, how that's different from what you're criticizing or what you're critiquing other foundations from doing. The logical extent would be one part, the party that's currently not benefiting from disinformation would be more likely to win under your regime, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand. So the question is, disinformation, the effects of disinformation as well as the disinformation are asymmetrical.
Totally, yeah.
Much more a problem on the right than on the left, which means on the right it's been much more helpful to political figures and people who want to move on the right than it has been on the left. So if we were to successfully find a way to combat disinformation, wouldn't it widen the divide? And the answer is, I think not, partly because I am drawing a distinction between politicians and citizens, particularly with respect to disinformation, but on all these things. So for instance, take vote suppression, or take my Dropbox example. Republican elected officials are going to oppose that. I can go to them and I can say, what can we do together that would make them secure enough? And like nothing will work because, of course, the real reason they don't want Dropboxes is they think it helps the Democrats and hurts them. But the citizens who believe their arguments aren't doing it for that reason. They are believing the arguments, right? So where I'm concerned about the divide is in the polity at large. And one of the things that we've seen is if you can change the polity at large, the political figures will change eventually. That's why every political reform that's ever taken place, whether it was primary elections in the progressive era or referendum, has been done over the opposition of the people in office for whom this was not going to help. But so you have to build that support out there. But I believe that fixing the disinformation problem for the people at large who are getting this will not only not have that problem, but have the opposite effect. So at least that's the reason. But it's not gonna go down easily with elected officials. And one of the problems you'll have is disinformation from elected officials about your efforts to combat disinformation, which we see all the time.
Just a quick follow-up as well. So that partly answers my second question, but so what you spoke about 2 years ago on crafting the next set of ideas that would get a good banner as neoliberalism or something similar. That project seems like a very different theory of change than where you've landed here now.
How so?
It seems to me that that one is much more top-down. It's crafting this like wide set of ideas that everyone buys into, as opposed to this bottom-up buying into the nuts and bolts of the system, but that then is essentially bottom-up as opposed to top-down.
Okay. Well, that's a hard question so I'm going to take that as two-part question. So one part is there a tension between the idea of the rethinking political economy stuff, which is a top-down ideas thing, and this answer I just gave, which is the solution to disinformation is bottom-up? Okay. So what I would say is actually they're both top-down on the solution side, and they're both bottom-up in what the effects need to be, right? So my solution, the set of solutions I have in mind for disinformation, that's the point. I think we're going to need legislation. We're going to need to change it at the systems level, at the platform level. But the reason for doing it is because it'll change how ordinary citizens are thinking about stuff. And it's the same thing with the ideas around political economy. The idea is you're not going to develop those ideas. The people at large are not going to develop, Keynesian economics or neoliberal, whatever it is. But you need to look at elites and elite institutions, not just universities, think tanks, lots of places leaders in movements, by the way, who I regard as part of the elite, to help develop the ideas, but ultimately to make them work, they have to become persuasive to the larger politic.
Okay, Leslie Winter was going to attempt to ask a question. Can you say to your microphone, Leslie Winter?
Leslie Winter,
Leslie Winter? Leslie?
ask a question, I guess, Leslie, speak. Speak.
Did she put it in the chat? Okay.
Can we go to a different-
Can we go to the next question from Clara Miller?
Sure. Hey, Clara.
Yes, so Clara Miller submitted this question. How are you measuring your success or at times lack thereof?
So how are we measuring success? So I don't have an easy answer for that yet, because as I said, the two new strategies are brand new. With the old, I can tell you how we were measuring it on the older Madison Initiative. As I said, for me, one of the key measures was public approval of Congress, but we had a whole bunch of subsidiary measures, including amount of legislation, extent of bipartisan support for legislation, number of Ds and Rs coming to different kinds of events, and so on. So we had a whole slew of those. I don't think we've actually fully figured out exactly how we're going to measure success yet on the rebuilding confidence in elections, other than obviously there is a gross measure, which is how people report, what kind of confidence they have in the election system. But we're going to need a lot more than that. The rebuilding stuff is easier, the rebuilding executive capacity, because that's not a general thing. We have a bunch of specific targeted initiatives. So, for instance, civil service reform, and so we'll be measuring success on the extent to which we get civil service reform. Same thing with technology or whatever it is. But we'll still have to work out, I think, measures for the rebuilding confidence in elections.
And one more from Zoom. Leslie Lankowski asks, there is an increasingly prominent line of criticism among journalists and scholars that foundations are bad for democracy since they privilege the views of their donors, and those who work for foundations. How do you respond to that?
So the question is, how do I respond to the criticism that foundations are bad for democracy because they privilege the views of the wealthy donors and the people who work at foundations? So I have so many answers to that. There's a whole bunch. So one, my first question is then what's the alternative? By the way, I do think foundations can be bad for democracy for the reason I mentioned, which is when they do their philanthropy in ways that deepen the problems of democracy. I think that's definitely a problem. This critique is something different. It's not, they're bad for democracy because in some sense we are promoting, it's like, this is the Rob Reich criticism, we're promoting plutocracy. Right. So my first question with respect to that is, tell me what your alternative looks like. If it means getting rid of foundations and just giving their money back to the government, where it'll not go to do anything different than what government is already doing, because in fact it's a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of money compared to what we're talking about in overall government budgets. The question you want to be asking is not, is there some plutocratic problem here, but are foundations on the whole doing more good than bad? So that's one answer. Second answer, should foundations work differently though? And the answer is, I think it depends on the problem. In some ways, yes, and I think foundations are beginning to adapt to that. The one thing that I don't agree with though is, at the end of the day, I can't escape the responsibility for making choices with respect to the resources that I have. So if we're not just giving them back to the government, then we're going to be giving them to somebody, and they're going to have to make a decision, even if they're trying to listen to all sorts of voices and how to do that. I had a grantee once say to me when I explained that we weren't going to give them a grant, and the grantee was like, well, you're not entitled to those resources. To which I said, you're right, I'm not, but neither are you. Not you. So the question is, who should they go to? And somebody has to make that decision. And I'm in the either enviable or unenviable, depending on how you look at it, I sometimes look at it both ways, position of having to make that choice. So I'm going to do it, and I'll do it as best I can and try to listen to as many voices as I can. And then the third answer that's a part of that is, I think people both understate the extent and importance of the actual pluralism in philanthropy. It would be one thing if, in fact, all foundations lined up around the same set of ideas and pushed the same set of things in the same place, but it's actually not the case. So if you actually look across the field of philanthropy, particularly if you take not just professional foundations, but all the wealthy individuals who are giving money away, what you see is there's actually a pretty big spread there, a lot like the spread that you have in the polity at large. And so there are philanthropic resources going on opposite sides of almost everything, pushing all sorts of different proposals. Is it perfect? No. But in the effort to make it perfect, are you more likely to make it worse? I believe yes, or at least nobody has yet given me a way to do this that I think is on balance better. So this was always, the argument I used to have with Rob Reich all the time was his whole position came from a perspective of ideal theory. From a perspective of ideal theory about democracy, you definitely can't justify foundations. You also can't justify most of the rest of our system. But we don't have an ideal democracy. We never have, nobody has, ever will. I used to teach my students, I would say to them, if somebody gives you a theory that has never actually been in the real world and never could be in the real world, the problem is probably with the theory. So for me, this is a pragmatic assessment of, on balance, how well do I think foundations are doing relative to what the next best alternative somebody's giving me is. We are obligated to listen to those alternatives and adapt and adjust as best we can. I think we do that and are doing that increasingly, but at the end of the day, again, we can't escape the responsibility for having to make those decisions. And, you know, I've also said to somebody who's like giving me the criticism, it's like, well, you know, why haven't I supported these organizations? It's like, well, yeah, all those organizations think I'm doing wrong because I'm not supporting them. Now let's talk to all these organizations, the one that I'm supporting, and see what they think about it, right? I mean, again, there's just not this simple neutral place from which to make these decisions. Otherwise, we could just put it into a computer and be done. So we can't escape the choices. We do the best we can. We're pretty pluralistic, and we need to approach it pragmatically. That would be my set of answers.
All right, thank you very much. Fascinating points, questions have been great, and everybody here, I'm sure, is happy to have the opportunity to hear you again, and we hope you'll come back again in the future. We'll let you talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. But I want
Didn't get to the Beatles today.
well, that's
Talk about letting
good
me- get back, sorry.
good for next time. The next time is going to be Faye Twersky, who was at the Hewlett Foundation and is now at the Arthur Blank Foundation in Atlanta. She was the one I mentioned earlier who had started the program on improving philanthropy that I described earlier. And then on March the 16th, we have a special FIRG seminar featuring John Rice, who founded Management Leadership for Tomorrow as a way of increasing the number of African Americans and other minorities in business schools. And at this point, it's still the largest supplier of such candidates to the business schools. And that's March 16th. And the final FIRG session is on April the 6th, where Sam Gill, president of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, formerly at the Knight Foundation, will be speaking. So that's the roster. Stay tuned. We'd love to have you come back, and I hope you will come back and come often. As a matter of fact, you have a wonderful way of stimulating people, and whether they disagree with you or agree with you, one way or the other, and that both are really important. So, Larry, thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you from the Zoom audience for participating, and stay tuned on how to do this for the next ones. If you were invited to this one, you'll be invited to the others as well. So have a good evening, and have I forgotten anything? I hope not.
I'll just say thank you to all of you for coming out, particularly under the circumstances, and for listening in. And I love coming here. It's really every time. So I'll always happily come back. But thank you.